Story 1 provided by Jacob Miller. People always talk about those moments in life when you feel like you've been split into two versions of yourself. The person who's living the moment and the person watching it happen from the outside. That was me, standing there on the side of a dark highway, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, with a decision that would change everything. My name's Jason, just an ordinary guy, working a warehouse job in the city. Not much to my life besides paying rent and catching up on shows when I'm not dead tired. I don't take risks. I don't go looking for adventure. But that night, I did something I never thought I'd do again. It all started when I went to this party. A buddy of mine, Mark, dragged me there. It wasn't even my kind of crowd, just a bunch of people I didn't know, drinking and telling stories about their wild lives. I stayed for a couple of hours, had a couple of drinks, but nothing too crazy, and when the night started to wind down, I figured it was time to get out of there. Mark was staying, so I was on my own. I'd taken the bus there, but by the time I left, I'd missed the last one back to the city. I checked my phone for an Uber, but my account was short on funds. Classic, right? No cash, no ride, and now it's past midnight. That's when I made the call. A choice I've replayed in my head 1,000 times since then. I figured I'd hitchhike. It wasn't the first time, and the last time went fine, so I started walking, hoping I'd get lucky. The road was a quiet, two-lane stretch that cut through fields and woods. Not exactly remote, but far enough that cars were sparse at that hour. It was one of those nights where the air is so still it feels like the whole world is asleep, except you. The only sounds were my shoes crunching on gravel and the distant hum of an occasional car in the distance. After about 10 minutes of walking, I saw headlights behind me. I didn't even think twice, just stuck my thumb out. The car slowed down, an older sedan, maybe late 90s, headlights flickering slightly as it pulled to the side. I felt a tiny wave of relief. I wouldn't have to walk the rest of the way home. The passenger window rolled down and I bent over to see inside. It was dark and the driver wasn't easy to make out, but he had a calm voice, low and gravelly. "Where you headed?" he asked. "Just up toward the city. If you're going that way, I'd really appreciate it." He paused for a second. "Sure, hop in." Looking back, maybe that pause should have told me something. It wasn't long, but there was hesitation. Still, I pulled the door open, slid into the seat, and buckled my seatbelt. I figured if I wasn't comfortable, I'd just get out at the next stop. The inside of the car smelled faintly of cigarettes, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place, like old fast food or stale air. The guy driving was middle-aged, maybe mid-40s, wearing a beat-up baseball cap that covered most of his face. I noticed his hands resting on the wheel, calloused and rough, like he worked with them every day. For a while, we drove in silence. The only noise was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal as we merged onto the main highway. I tried to make some small talk, just to break the silence. Asked him where he was headed, how long he'd been driving. He didn't say much, just short, curt responses, and after a few tries, I gave up. It didn't seem that weird at first. People have bad days, right? Maybe he wasn't in the mood to chat, and that was fine. I leaned back, watching the dark road ahead of us, and zoned out for a bit. But after what felt like a good 20 minutes, I noticed something was off. The road we were on wasn't familiar anymore. I knew this area well enough to recognize when we were getting close to the city, but the longer we drove, the more rural it became. The fields stretched out endlessly, and there were fewer and fewer lights dotting the distance. I glanced at my phone. No service. I hate that sinking feeling in your gut, like your body knows something's wrong before your mind catches up. I kept calm though, didn't want to freak out over nothing. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "We still heading toward the city? This road doesn't look familiar." He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. After a beat, he finally said, "Yeah, I know a shortcut. Trust me, we'll get there quicker this way." That sounded reasonable enough, but something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. The way he phrased it, "trust me," felt off. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, like he was reassuring himself as much as me. I nodded slowly, trying to shake off the creeping unease. I kept looking out the window, hoping to see something familiar, but everything around us was just empty. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker, and the road narrower. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my heart race. A pair of shoes. Not just any shoes, small, pink sneakers, the kind a little girl might wear, tossed haphazardly on the backseat floor. There was no one else in the car, and yet, there they were, looking too out of place, too deliberate. I didn't say anything, but my mind started spiraling. Why were those there? Who did they belong to? And why hadn't I noticed them before? I glanced at the driver, trying to gauge his expression, but he kept his face turned slightly away, the brim of his cap casting a shadow over his eyes. The quiet in the car felt heavier, like the air itself was suffocating me. "Those shoes," I blurted out before I could stop myself. "You have kids?" For a second I thought he hadn't heard me. But then, slowly, he turned his head. Just enough so I could see the corner of his mouth twitch into a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Something like that," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. That's when I knew I had to get out of that car. I don't know how I knew, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to leave. But how? We were still on a deserted highway, and if I made a move too soon, who knows what he'd do. I tried to think fast, keeping my voice steady. "Actually, you can let me out here. I don't mind walking the rest of the way." His grip tightened on the wheel. He didn't even look at me this time. "We're not there yet." My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could probably hear it. I tried again, more insistent this time. "No, seriously, I'll get out here, it's fine." Silence. The road stretched on, long and desolate, and for the first time I realized there hadn't been another car for miles. Just me, him, and the endless stretch of blacktop disappearing into the night. I was about to make a move for the door, thinking maybe I could jump out if I had to, when he suddenly veered the car off the road and onto a narrow dirt path leading into the woods. That was it. I wasn't going to wait to find out what his plan was. My hands fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. My breath caught in my throat as I tried again, harder this time, but it was stuck. Locked. He hadn't said a word, just kept driving down that narrow path, the trees closing in on either side of us, their branches scraping against the car like fingers clawing at the windows. I was panicking now, my hands shaking as I tried to keep calm. I looked around the car, trying to find something, anything I could use. My eyes landed on the dashboard, the flickering light from the speedometer casting a dim glow over the interior. And then I saw it. The lock on the passenger door, manual. With one swift motion, I reached over and yanked it up, hearing the click as the door unlocked. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed the handle, flung the door open, and jumped out. I hit the ground hard, rolling across the dirt and gravel, the impact knocking the wind out of me. But I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and started running. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from him. I could hear the car screech to a halt behind me, but I didn't look back. My legs pumped harder than they ever had in my life, the trees blurring past me as I sprinted down the dirt path, praying I'd make it to the main road. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I reached the highway. My lungs burned and my body ached, but I kept going until I saw headlights in the distance. A truck this time. Real help. I waved it down and the driver stopped. I barely managed to explain what had happened, breathless and terrified. He took me to the nearest police station where I gave my report, but they never found the guy. And those pink shoes? I still think about them sometimes late at night when the silence gets too heavy and the shadows seem too long. Story 2, credited to Mark Wilkins. I've always been careful about who I trust. I don't let my guard down, especially when I'm out on the road alone. But one night, I had no choice. It was a Friday evening, and I was supposed to pick up my sister from college. She'd texted me earlier saying she'd be ready by 10 p.m., so I left the house around 8. The drive wasn't anything I hadn't done a dozen times before. 2 hours of straight highway. Nothing out of the ordinary. But about halfway there, my car, a beat-up old Honda that should have been scrapped years ago, started acting up. It sputtered a few times, and then the engine light started blinking furiously. I pulled over, just hoping the engine wouldn't completely die. No such luck. Smoke started pouring out from under the hood, and just like that, I was stranded. It was a stretch of highway with nothing but trees on either side, barely any streetlights. I was hoping I'd catch a cell signal, but of course there was nothing. My phone was practically a brick. Dead battery. My fault for not charging it before I left. I mean, who carries a car charger anymore, right? I thought about waiting it out. Maybe someone would drive by, or maybe I'd just have to sleep in the car and deal with it in the morning. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. The night was dark, darker than usual, and there wasn't a single car for miles. Just silence. That kind of silence that presses down on you makes you hyper-aware of your surroundings. I couldn't stand it, so I decided to start walking. Figured there had to be a gas station or diner at the next exit, maybe a few miles up the road. It was risky, but waiting in the dead car wasn't any better. And after a good 20 minutes of walking, I finally saw headlights coming up behind me. Now, here's the thing. I don't hitchhike. Ever. I've heard the stories, you know? And in today's world, you just don't take that chance. But when you're stranded in the middle of nowhere, your brain starts to justify things. It's just a short ride, I told myself. I'll be fine. So, I stuck out my thumb. The car slowed. A black pickup truck, older model, definitely had some wear on it. The driver rolled down the window, and inside was a guy who looked about my dad's age. Mid-40s maybe, with a weathered face and a cigarette hanging from his lips. "You need a lift?" he asked, eyes squinting through the smoke. I hesitated for a second, but what else was I gonna do? The longer I stood there, the more likely I'd be spending the night on that road. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound confident. "Car broke down a few miles back. Just need a ride to the next exit." At first, everything seemed fine. He was quiet, didn't ask too many questions, which was a relief. The radio was turned off, and the only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt. But after a few minutes, I noticed he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. Not full-on staring, just these quick side glances like he was sizing me up. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was overthinking it because, well, who wouldn't feel weird hitching a ride with a stranger? "You're lucky I came by," he said after a long stretch of silence. His voice was rough, like he'd been smoking for years. "Yeah, thanks," I said, keeping it short. I didn't want to make small talk. I just wanted to get to the next exit and be done with it. He took a drag of his cigarette, then flicked the ashes out the window. Not many people stop for hitchhikers anymore. I nodded, gripping my seatbelt a little tighter. Guess it's not as safe as it used to be. He chuckled, this low, raspy sound that didn't quite feel right. "Nope. A lot of folks go missing out on these roads." I froze. Did he just say that? "Yeah," he continued, "especially around here. A couple months back, some kid disappeared after hitching a ride. Never found him." I felt my stomach drop. Maybe it was a coincidence, him bringing that up. Maybe it was just his way of making conversation. But every part of me wanted to be anywhere but in that truck. "Don't worry, though," he said, glancing over at me with this grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "I ain't like that." I forced a smile, but I could feel my heart racing now. I needed to think of a way out, but we were still in the middle of nowhere. No streetlights, no signs of civilization. Then, without warning, he took a sudden turn onto a narrow dirt road. I looked around. There was no reason to be off the highway. My pulse quickened. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Shortcut," he said, his eyes still fixed on the road. "Get you to the next town quicker." Everything in my gut told me that was a lie. I could feel the panic rising, but I couldn't just jump out of a moving truck. I needed to keep calm, needed to play it smart. "Actually," I said, faking a smile, "I think I'm just gonna get off here. I don't mind walking." He didn't slow down, didn't even acknowledge what I'd said. My hand tightened on the door handle. I said, "You can drop me off here. I'm good." Still nothing. He just kept driving, that grin still plastered on his face. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could probably hear it. And then I saw it. Up ahead, a faint light. It looked like a gas station maybe, or a small diner. Whatever it was my only chance. "Stop the truck," I said, louder this time, my voice trembling. He glanced over at me, eyes narrowing. "Why? We're almost there. I'm getting out." I yanked the door handle, but it didn't budge. Locked. For a split second, I thought about fighting him. Maybe I could grab the wheel, steer us into the ditch. But before I could do anything, the truck slowed to a crawl. We were right in front of the gas station. I didn't wait for him to stop fully. I unlocked the door, shoved it open, and jumped out, landing hard on the gravel. I didn't even look back. I just ran toward the station, heart pounding in my chest. When I finally got inside, the clerk looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I didn't care. I was safe. I never saw that guy again. The police couldn't find him, and I didn't have much to tell them anyway. No plate number, no real description. But every time I think about it, I wonder how close I came to being another one of those stories. You know, the ones where people go missing out on these empty highways, never to be seen again. Story 3 credited to Daniel Miller. I wasn't planning on hitchhiking that night. I never do. It's not something you think you'll ever have to do, you know? But when you're stranded and there's no other option, you start rethinking all the things you swore you'd never do. It was last summer, sometime in August, and I had just finished visiting an old friend from high school. He'd moved out to this tiny town in upstate New York, a couple of hours from the city. We hadn't seen each other in years, so I figured I'd make the trip, spend the night, and catch up. Everything was fine until the next day. I left his place a little later than I should have, probably around 9 p.m., thinking I'd be able to make it back home before midnight. My plan was to get on the highway and just cruise. But about halfway through, I hit this long, isolated stretch of road. No streetlights, no traffic, just miles of empty asphalt surrounded by thick trees. I was the only car on the road for what felt like hours. Then, my worst nightmare happened. The car started making this grinding noise, like something was scraping against the engine. I ignored it at first, hoping it was nothing serious, but within minutes, I felt the car jerking. Then, the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, every warning light flashing at once. I pulled over, hoping it was something small I could fix, but as soon as I stopped, the engine died completely. Just like that. I tried restarting it. Nothing. I opened the hood, looked around like I knew what I was doing, which I didn't, and fiddled with a few wires. Still nothing. And of course, my phone had no signal. It was like I was in the middle of a dead zone. I stood there for a minute, staring out into the empty road, hoping maybe, just maybe, another car would come by. But nothing. Not a single car in sight. I waited. 30 minutes, maybe an hour. It felt like forever. Eventually, I realized I wasn't going to get any help sitting there. So I decided to start walking. The nearest gas station was about 6 or 7 miles back, and I figured I could make it there before midnight if I hurried. About half an hour into my walk, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. Finally, I thought. Finally, someone's coming. I stuck my thumb out, hoping for the best. The car slowed down. It was an old, beat-up Chevy, the kind you'd see in those 80s movies, with rust along the edges and a low, rumbling engine. It stopped right beside me, and the driver rolled down the window. He was this older guy, maybe in his 50s or 60s, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice raspy like he'd been smoking his whole life. I hesitated. Every instinct I had told me not to get in that car. But then I thought about how far I still had to walk and how late it was getting. I convinced myself it'd be fine. It was just a short ride, right? "Yeah," I said. "My car broke down a few miles back. Just trying to get to the gas station." "Hop in," he said, nodding to the passenger seat. I got in, immediately regretting it as the door shut behind me. The inside of the car smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, and there were fast food wrappers scattered all over the floor. The guy didn't say anything for a while, just kept driving, staring straight ahead. "So," he finally said, after what felt like an eternity of silence, "car trouble, huh?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. It just died on me out of nowhere. He nodded, still not looking at me. "Happens out here. These roads aren't great for old cars." I forced a smile, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, or maybe it was the way his hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly. We drove in silence for a while longer. The road was dark, no streetlights, just the dim glow of his headlights cutting through the trees. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a signal, but there was nothing. I was trapped in this car with no way of contacting anyone. "Where are you headed?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Just back to the city," I said. "I was visiting a friend." He nodded again, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You're lucky I came by. Not many people travel this road at night." "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Lucky." Something about the way he said that word, lucky, sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake it off, but the tension in the car was growing, thick and suffocating. After what felt like hours, we finally passed a small sign for the gas station. Relief washed over me. Just a few more minutes, I told myself. I'll be out of here soon. But then, instead of slowing down, he sped up. The gas station's back there, I said, pointing out the window. I know, he replied, not even glancing at the sign. My heart started racing. What are you doing? I thought you were taking me to the station. He didn't answer, he just kept driving, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wheel. Panic started setting in. I looked at the door, wondering if I could jump out, but we were going too fast. There was no way I'd make it. Stop the car, I demanded, my voice shaking. Let me out. Still nothing. He just stared straight ahead, that eerie smile creeping back onto his face. I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. My mind was racing now, trying to figure out what to do. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath coming in short gasps. And then out of nowhere, he spoke again. You know, he said slowly, people go missing out here all the time. Just disappear. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, completely at his mercy, and every second that passed, I felt the car moving further and further away from safety. Suddenly, I saw a light up ahead, a pair of headlights coming toward us. Another car, thank God. I started waving frantically, hoping they'd see me. The driver slowed down as they passed us, but they didn't stop. My heart sank as their lights disappeared into the distance. I was on my own. Then, out of nowhere, the guy slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, and I was thrown forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest. My head was spinning, but I didn't waste any time. I unlocked the door and jumped out before he could react. I hit the ground hard, but I didn't care. I scrambled to my feet and started running as fast as I could toward the lights of the gas station in the distance. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran. By the time I reached the gas station, I was out of breath, my legs shaking. I burst through the door, gasping for air, and the clerk behind the counter looked at me like I was crazy. You okay, man? He asked. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. There's a guy, I said between gasps. A guy in a truck. He tried to take me. The clerk looked confused, but he nodded. We'll call the cops. Just sit tight. I collapsed into one of the chairs by the window, my heart still racing. I kept glancing out into the parking lot, expecting to see that truck pull in at any second. But it never did. The cops showed up about 20 minutes later. I gave them a description of the guy, but they didn't seem too hopeful. A lot of drifters come through here, one of the officers said. It's hard to track them down. I never saw him again. To this day, I don't know what he wanted or what he was planning to do. But I'll never forget the way he looked at me, the way his smile twisted as he talked about people disappearing. I haven't hitchhiked since, and I never will.